You are listening to the podcast That's Life in Sweden, or as we say in Swedish, Sånt är livet i Sverige, with me, your host, Liisa Uusimaki. Meet Patrick Blessinger, the Director and Chief Scientist and founder of the International Higher Education Teaching and Learning Association, or HETL. This will be the first episode of 2. I'd like to welcome Patrick Blessinger to the program. How are you this morning?
I'm very good. Thank you for asking, Lisa, and thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
Oh, this is going to be a wonderful conversation. I cannot wait to ask you about your work with International Higher Education Teaching and Learning Association. If you can share some of your reasons and background for developing the site or the association.
It started with an idea back in 2010. I was in Denmark at the time. I was awarded, at the time I was living in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm originally from Indiana, United States. But ended up in Atlanta, Georgia years later. I was teaching there at a college in the Atlanta area, and I was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship through the Department of State to go to Denmark to teach for a semester. And so I was over there. I met my future wife there, who is Danish, and we both decided that I should move there. So I actually moved there the next year. And we married, and I was working at a college in Copenhagen. I spent about 4 years there. And while teaching at the college, it just seemed to me that there was a need to improve the teaching and learning process in higher education. And because from my perspective at the time, and my perspective is still the same today, that is really the heart of any educational institution, whether it be kindergarten or middle school or high school or higher education, or even further or continuing education. The central organizing principle of any educational institution is to produce learning, and the primary way that we do that as humans is through the teaching process. And so my belief is that, that is the common denominator. The teaching and learning process is the common denominator, the central organizing principle that every educational institution has, regardless of grade level, regardless of mission and focus, etc. And I thought, well, if that's the case, then, there should be an organization that focuses on that, and that does the research, that does the networking, that brings people together globally, regardless of culture, regardless of country or language or whatever, and to marshal together the resources and the leadership to, improve, do the research and come up with ideas on how we can improve the teaching and learning process. So that was sort of the seed that was planted in my brain during, actually, earlier, but it became sort of, a motivating factor for my life in 2010. And so I decided to, to start going down that road. And the first thing I did was I looked at how I could do this, right? And in 2010, social media was just first coming on the scene. You had Facebook that was starting to become popular. Of course, at the time in 2010, there was really no way of knowing, which platforms would be the, dominant platforms in that industry, because there were a lot of apps at the time, Friendster and just, many, many apps. But in doing my due diligence and my research, I decided, Facebook and LinkedIn in particular, and Twitter, they are probably, based on my own research, my own analysis, they are probably going to be the platforms that will become the dominant platform. So that's what I focused my energy on. And it really started, very simply by creating a group on LinkedIn called the higher education teaching and learning group. My apologies. I got a little cold that I'm still getting over. So I'm having to deal with that. But so I created this group on LinkedIn, and I simply started inviting fellow academics, fellow faculty members, fellow professors, fellow administrators, university leaders, from vice chancellors to provosts to presidents, anyone who is involved in the higher education enterprise. And to my pleasant surprise, they just started joining, by the thousands. It didn't take much convincing. And so that taught me, something else, that there was perhaps a critical mass out there of academics who also see a need to improve the teaching and learning process, but just haven't had maybe the network or the platform or the means to really make that happen on a global scale. So as the group sort of exploded into several thousand, just in the early months, I got a lot of and from all over the world, all the different countries. I was getting feedback from many of them saying, you should formalize this a little bit more. It should be more than just about a group, a social media group, although that's great, it's a good place to start. But, you should think about maybe turning it into a nonprofit, make it a legal entity. And, so I started to do the research. I felt like that was a good idea too. And a few years later, we had created the organization, a nonprofit status with the IRS here, and what we call a 501c3. And so I think it was from 2012. So for the last 10 years, we've been a bona fide nonprofit association focused on teaching and learning, research, service, sort of the three pillars of higher education institutions, teaching, research, and service, and all focused on improving learning. And so we do those things and it's been growing, very steadily ever since. We're a truly global organization now, and we do all those things that you would expect of an organization like ours. Those things that are important and relevant and meaningful to academics and to institutions, research, conferences, books, articles. Anything in the space that there's a need for, and that is relevant and will add value and benefit to the lives of academics as we try to improve what we do.
And you're doing that really well, I might add. I just love the material that you have on your site, and I have been following your work for years. And you of course yourself, you're also an author, so you publish quite a bit and about various issues. You started off as a teacher then?
Yes, and I started off as a teacher. I've done a little administrative work, but mainly it's at the faculty level. That's really where my passion is. I love working with students. Love motivating students to become more self-regulated learners. And but in my role as the president of HETL, I've really had to sort of up my game on the leadership front, and learn how to become more of an effective leader as I deal with all different types of people, all different types of organizations and cultures. And so that's been a process for me also, but one that I've enjoyed doing. And so I teach. I currently I teach at the K-12 level, also here in New York City. I work in the Bronx. I work at a school in the Bronx, and that's one of the more, I think it's fair to say, challenging areas of the country to work in as a K through 12 teacher. But I love doing that. I love working with the children, and I love putting them on the road to academic success and shaping their lives. I also work as an adjunct professor. I've been doing that for better part of a decade now, and I work at a couple of different institutions here: St. John's University in Queens and the State University of New York. And so I teach a variety of courses, leadership courses, courses in pedagogy and research, pretty much anything, dealing, with education. And so I love that also.
So, during the time you were in Denmark, did you taught in Denmark as well?
Yes, yeah. So I taught for about 3 years there. I was originally there, earlier as a Fulbright scholar. When I was there, I was actually sort of a roving itinerant teacher. I was going to different high schools. Yeah, I think I went to 3 or 4 different high schools. I taught for about a month at each one. And then when that assignment was over, I came back to the college. I was working in Atlanta, and I was contacted by someone from Denmark who was a friend of someone who I worked for at one of the schools, who had recommended me because they were build out their international faculty, and had invited me to come over and work there, as an instructor and or a lecturer, and so that's how I got over there. So I think it was several months later, I'd finished up my contract at the college I was at in Atlanta, and had moved over there and worked at that college. So I taught courses in international business, international economics, finance and accounting, strategic management, and I was also helping to manage the program also as an international program that was taught in English, but it catered to international students, a lot of students from China, in the Middle East and Africa and Europe. And so I enjoyed doing that also.
Can you explain, from your perspective, the central role of teaching and learning in higher education, especially?
Well, I think it's always been my belief that the fundamental purpose of any educational institution, especially, well, not especially, but including higher education, is learning, right? That's what it's all about. And that's what it's all been about, right? How do we produce learning in students, right? And as human beings, we've discovered, even with all the technology that we have today, the best way to do that is through the teaching process, right? Where you have an expert, a teacher, an instructor, a lecturer, a professor, whatever title you want to, ascribe to that person, but an expert in the field who is a content expert, but also a pedagogical, that is, teaching expert. So not only has mastered the content of their area, but also understands how to communicate that content, how to teach that content to the students, so they can, become content experts themselves. And so, teaching in that respect, and also if you look at the research at every level, I think it's fair to say that teaching is there are many variables that go into the learning process, but probably the most important and the most significant is probably the teaching variable. Where you have an expert that is facilitating that learning process in the student. And there are different ways to do that, through, direct lecture or communication. We've, discovered through all the research that's going on, in the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, there's, a variety of different ways to do that. There's even this movement called the flipped classroom movement, where the focus isn't so much on pure lecturing, but more on peer-to-peer student, peer instruction, where students are become teachers themselves and help facilitate that learning process in other students. And there's a lot of, and of course it works in some contexts. It may not work as well in other contexts. I happen to be an editor of a journal called the Journal of Applied Research in Higher Education. And so I see a lot. I've seen thousands and thousands of research. I've been doing that for the last decade or so. Thousands of research articles on this whole topic. Okay, and so context is also very important. So there are different ways, right, depending on the context, that learning can be facilitated. But it's my belief, that teaching, no matter how you slice and dice it, teaching is at the heart of it. It's got to be at the heart of it. And so since the teaching process is at the heart of learning, then the teacher, who is facilitating that process, becomes central, to making that happen. Yeah. There's also that, like, again, that can be done in a variety of ways. You can do it through research. So there's this whole movement, and I was also part of a book project that it just came out. The book came out, the Cambridge Handbook on Undergraduate Research. And so there's a whole field, there's a whole movement, really. It's a global movement now, and a lot of research that has been done on this, where research is used, engaging students from the moment they enter college, when they're, freshmen, to engage them in the research process. So the process itself becomes a learning opportunity where, they don't have to wait until they're in postgraduate school or working on the doctorate. They do it from, their first week in college or university, where they're engaged in doing research, different types of research. And that's one of the best ways to learn, of course, right, is to do research, create new knowledge. So there's this whole movement now of turning students from not just consumers of knowledge, right, where they're simply consuming knowledge that's already been created, but actually to turn them into producers of knowledge, where they're going beyond just consumption and they're engaging in the research process and actually producing new knowledge.
So, do you think teaching is more important than research?
Well, I would say, in this day and age, they're probably equal. I would say, whether you're a faculty member, a professor, I think it's important to. I know there are some, colleges and universities that focus on teaching, and they may even call themselves, teaching colleges or teaching universities. But I do think it's important, to, if you're a faculty member, from my perspective, to be engaged in research, even if you're not producing research, at the very least to be on top of what research is being produced and what new, fields and that are being developed and the new findings are being developed, to read, the journals, articles, books in one's specialty area, to keep on top of the latest developments, so that you can impart that to your students and become a better teacher. Yeah.
How do you understand sustainable internationalization and globalization?
Globalization and internationalization are really two sides of the same coin, okay? And where globalization can be thought of as an interconnectedness or an interdependentness between people across geographical locations. And of course, ever since, humankind first developed civilizations about 10,000 years ago or so, and they decided to stop becoming hunter-gatherers and form communities and, develop agriculture, in the first agricultural revolution going back 10,000 years, they we've started the globalization has almost been just a natural consequence of that, because once we decided to settle down and form communities and start domesticating animals and domesticating plants for crops, right, then then we got into trade, and started trading with other communities nearby, and so you could even make a case going all the way back that's where the seeds of globalization started, and then as new innovations have been developed, new technologies have been developed, we've just been doing that faster, and now we're at a point where the technology has improved so much and we're so interconnected. And this is a perfect example of it. We have, you and I are communicating on this application called WhatsApp. And it's virtually no different than you and I sitting right next to each other physically having a conversation, but we're simply doing it through this device called a smartphone. So yeah, so it's a wonderful, it's a wonderful time to be living in with all these advancements. And so this is how, how much we become interconnected and interdependent now. And that interdependency is really the critical part, because you can see that with interconnectedness, comes interdependence. As we, countries specialize in what they produce. Some countries specialize in automobiles, and they're very good at that. Other countries specialize in certain kinds of foods that they sell across the world. And so, this will continue, into the future. In the United States, for example, the most popular cars are so-called foreign cars, but it's almost, even calling them foreign now is almost doesn't make sense, because they're virtually all produced in the United States. So Japanese automakers, German automakers, South Korean automakers, they all have dozens of plants, spread throughout the United States, and so that will continue, as we move into the future. One just need look at the trends that have occurred over the last generation, or really ever since really the major sort of watershed moment in recent human history has been the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s, because that's what's really sparked all of this. That is what has kicked globalization and internationalization into high gear. Knowledge feeds upon itself, and so as more knowledge is produced, more knowledge is consumed, and as more knowledge is consumed, more knowledge is produced. So it has sort of a virtuous cycle. And so now we're seeing an exponential explosion of information and new knowledge. More books and journals and information is being produced now than ever before. Education, is at the heart of it. That's why, HETL, for example, HETL focuses on SDG 4, which is focused on quality education. Because if you look at these other, all 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and that, which was launched in 2015, also known as the 2030 Agenda. And if you look at them all, one can actually go through these and sort of categorize them into sort of clusters, right? And so you look at economic development, number 8, that's very critical. But so number 1, which is poverty reduction, depends on number 8, economic development. So those two could be clustered together, right? You look at number 11, which is sustainable cities. Well, that's going to be dependent upon number 13, climate action. Okay. And, but, it's my belief that all of these um, really depend on education, right? Which is number 4. Because without an educated population of citizens, right, not much is going to get done. And so you have to have, whether it's political development, um, for strengthening democracy, or whether it's economic development, right, reducing poverty and crime rates, improving healthcare. From my perspective, all of that depends on education, because without education, there are no doctors, there are no scientists, there are no, um, you know, yeah, educated people and specialists and professionals to produce all these innovations. So everything really depends on and is a function of of the quality of one's educational system. It starts with preschool and kindergarten and goes all the way up to, higher education and lifelong learning. Now, internationalization is just, how we respond, to that process, right? And so companies, will internationalize their product line, for example, and they will start producing products and services for international markets. Therefore, globalization triggers internationalization, which triggers more globalization, which triggers more internationalization. So it's a virtuous, from my perspective, it's on the whole, I would consider virtuous cycle. Some might consider it a vicious cycle, but I tend to be a little bit more on the positive side, and I would consider it a virtuous cycle. But when this cycle happens, then that puts pressures on governments, policymakers, institutional leaders to come up with appropriate rules, laws, regulations, and policies on how to manage that, right? So that we have, so that we promote economic growth, for example, we promote democratic values, um, we promote low inflation, and that's a problem, the whole world is dealing with now is hyperinflation. So, we have to respond to that, right? Countries have to respond to that, hopefully in a coordinated way, to help, reduce those inflation rates. We have the war in Ukraine. That's one factor, in all of this, especially in Europe. That depends. Certain European countries depend a lot on, Russian gas, for example. So we're all interconnected and interdependent. And so internationalization is just, how we respond to that globalization process.
Do you think that technology will take the place for face-to-face teaching and learning?
I don't think it will ever replace it. I think, well, first of all, you have to have, it depends on kind of what level you're talking about and in what way. But first of all, you have to have someone, well, I was going to say you have to have someone to produce that knowledge, but we're actually at a point now where artificial intelligence and the applications that we're developing for artificial intelligence are starting to produce on their own. You give it a question, okay, and it will go through the AI algorithm and may produce, a 10,000 page article.
That's scary.
Yeah, yeah, it is scary.
Yeah, what do you think of that?
Well, I read an article in one of the mass publications. I forget the name of it, but it was like 4 or 5 months ago, where this journalist went onto this AI application. You can go onto it. You can subscribe to it for a small fee. You can become a customer of the application. You can put in queries, and it will, produce a response. This particular, she was a journalist, and she was actually able to get the AI application to produce a journal article, right? and she had submitted that. She didn't really write it herself. The AI application had written it, and she had taken that because she wanted to see if it was, of the same quality, of a human being. She actually submitted it to a journal. Now, when she wrote it, she hadn't heard back from the journal yet on whether it was accepted, but that's where we're headed, right? And we only scratched the surface of how all of this is going to develop. Now, on the flip side of the coin, like I mentioned earlier that I was the editor of a journal. We keep having to implement more and more sophisticated algorithms and applications that protect against those kind of submissions. We have a system that generates, it's called unusual activity reports. So we use our own. Yeah, and I would imagine that most publishers are doing the same now, because you have to guard against fraudulent submissions. You have to guard against maybe even there's a whole host of unethical and unprofessional practices that are possible that an editor and a publisher have to guard against, right? And so we take that very seriously, but it's almost like a cat and mouse game, right? You're always having to stay a little bit ahead of the curve to make sure that what you're producing was actually produced by a human being, that it's actually factual data, that it hasn't been fabricated or made up. But we have very rigorous processes and procedures and protocols in place to prevent those sort of things from happening. And now we're even using, more and more sophisticated software, right, to aid efforts.
It's yes, I was just talking to some of my colleagues at the Swedish university, and we are aware of this what is it called, ChatGPT, and you can put in a question and it will spit out this essay, if you like, or really quite interesting responses. But so so what is going to happen, because we are very suspicious now at university at the essay students hand to us, and so they all say, well, we just have to go back to the oral examinations.
Well, we may get to that point, because cheating is very prevalent, right? From what I understand, most universities, most colleges, if not all, have implemented some form of anti-plagiarism checking, using their very sophisticated, applications out there now, Turnitin and other ones, where you can put and they're free online too, so anyone can Google that. They can, I think Google itself, the Google company, actually has their own anti-plagiarism software that you can use for free. You simply paste in the text or upload an entire document, and it will check all that text against matches on any public website, and there are billions of them out there, and within seconds it will tell you what matches it found, right?
And you have been listening to the podcast Sånt är livet i Sverige, or as we say in English, That's Life in Sweden, with me, Liisa Uusimaki. We've also have heard the first episode of Patrick Blessinger and about HETL. The second episode is forthcoming, and there Patrick will be talking about democratization of higher education. Till then, take care of yourself and each other's. Bye for now.